As, as we are about to begin, I would like to invite all participants to be seated. Kindly ensure that your mobile phones are on silent mode for a pleasant and uninterrupted session. We will begin very shortly. Announcing the arrival of Yang Berhormat Liu Chintong, Deputy Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry. Assalamualaikum, salam sejahtera, and very good afternoon. Welcome, everyone, to the keynote lecture on economic growth in middle-income countries. How can countries escape the middle-income trap? Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Shakira De Sharifuddin from the World Bank, and I will be your MC for today. Today's session will begin with welcoming remarks by Dr. Indermit, Country Director for Brunei, Malaysia, Philippines, and Thailand at the World Bank. Hence, without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Diop up on stage to give his welcoming remarks.
Thank you very much. I will be very short because I'm only the warming act here. I know everybody is excited and looking forward to our chief economist lecture and the panel. So it is really absolutely my pleasure and distinct honor to welcome you all here on behalf of the World Bank Group. I'm extremely excited to see our panel. I think they deserve no introduction. They are key resource people for us and for everyone here in Malaysia. And I'm really excited that they could all join us today, and they will be introduced later. So thank you very, very much for taking the time to join us today. I'm also very delighted that our chief economist of the World Bank Group and senior vice president, Indermit Gill, could come to Malaysia. So Indermit is no stranger to Malaysia. He's been coming here for a long time. I think his first visit was in the 90s, 1994. And he's been really very attached to, I know he's attached to Malaysia. He loves this country. So we are very honored, pleased, and happy to have him come to join us today. For me, as I was mentioning last night, it's something of a sort of personal achievement to get Indermit here, because I will be moving on after 4 years as country director for Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, and Brunei to my next job. So last time I saw him in April, I said, boss, you promised, and now I'm moving in 2 months. You don't have any choice. He said, I will come in June. So he delivered. So thank you very much for that. The topic today is one that resonates very well in Malaysia. I was very struck over the last several years working in Malaysia that this topic often comes back. Even though when we look at the projection at the World Bank, you know, we kind of see Malaysia crawling there and hopefully getting there in the next few years. Still, I think the topic of middle income trap is something that is hotly debated in Malaysia. We are very fortunate that the person who coined this term in 2007 in a report, which is Indermit Gill, along with our other former colleague, Homi Karas, is here today. So there is no better person to really talk about this topic today. And we're also fortunate that the World Development Report 2024 is exactly on this topic. And we are very, very privileged to be the first to get a preview of this report. And this will be the first time Indermit presents this report outside of the bank. So we have a lot to celebrate and to be happy for today. With that, I would like to thank everyone for coming again and look forward to a very productive and fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Diop, for setting the stage for today's events. We will now move on to the lecture by Dr. Indermit Gill, Chief Economist of the World Bank Group and Senior Vice President for Development Economics. Dr. Gill has held several leadership positions in the World Bank, and he has also taught at Duke University and Georgetown University. He led the influential 2009 World Development Report on Economic Geography, and as mentioned by Dr. Indermit, Dr. Gill and his collaborator, Homi Karas, also introduced the concept of middle income trap, which describes how countries stagnate after reaching a certain level of income. This lecture will focus on this and possibly provide insights on strategies to overcome this stagnation. The floor is yours, Dr. Gill. You have about 45 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for those nice words. Thank you very much, ma'am. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do three things today. First, I'll give you some facts about the middle income trap, which is a term that is debated among empirical economists, but it's a real fear among policymakers, including policymakers here. The second is I'll quickly tell you about a framework that is based on advances in economic analysis. This is by Schumpeter and Analysis, and which identifies pathways for emerging market economies to avoid this middle income trap. And basically, the main thing that you probably need to know is that that countries need to go through, or they need to avoid not one but two traps in terms of their journey to high income. And neither one of these transitions is actually automatic, and the framework actually provides insights on how these forces aid these transitions and which ones stiffen the status quo in some sense. And then finally, I'll provide you some insights on the basis of policy from the framework, but also from the experience of countries. It's just a handful of countries that have actually gone to high income through middle income over the last 30, 40 years. And so I'll tell you about that. Now, before I do that, I have to tell you a little bit about my association with Malaysia. So I actually came to Malaysia in 1994, as Indermit said. So it's been 30 years. And my last trip was exactly 15 years ago. And one of the things I have to tell you is that my general impression of Malaysia has always been great. I have a lot of Malaysian friends and so on. But, so 30 years ago, I remember that it was a very different Malaysia. And Malaysia had 2 or 3 big questions ahead of it. One question, of course, was it was about peace, about building a peaceful society. And I think Malaysia has succeeded very well in that one. The second one was to build a diversified economy. So at that time, it wasn't clear whether Malaysia would end up being a country that would depend basically on natural resources, or whether it could become a quote-unquote a normal economy. And I think Malaysia has succeeded in that too. 2 big successes. Along the way, actually, the third question was, can Malaysia do what South Korea and Taiwan and others did? And I think that is something that Malaysia has not achieved yet. The word is yet. Okay? So I don't think that one should sort of see this as. So I know that Malaysia is not happy with the fact that it hasn't progressed at the same rate as South Korea or Taiwan or Hong Kong or Singapore, but each country is unique. Each country has their own unique challenges, and I think that Malaysia has done pretty well under the circumstances. The other thing I'll show you a few slides is to sort of say is that it's not as if Malaysia is alone in terms of struggling with this transition to high income. Malaysia has a lot of company, about 100 countries actually, so a lot of company. So here are how the World Bank defines middle income economies. It's a fairly frugal definition, by the way. I mean, essentially a country becomes middle income when it reaches about $1,500 per capita. This is a level that Malaysia reached back in the 1980s. And then when it transits to about $5,000, it goes into a stage called upper middle income. And Malaysia entered this stage quite a long time ago, about 25 years ago. So it did fairly quickly. It went from low income to upper middle income, and it's during the upper middle income stages that Malaysia has taken longer than what people would have expected, perhaps. But as you can sort of see over here, there are a lot of countries that are in the same situation as Malaysia was 20 years ago and is now. There are about 108 countries that we call middle income countries. About 50 of them are lower middle, 50 of them are upper middle income countries. And these countries basically are about 75% of the world's population. They are about 37.5%, about half of that in terms of the share of global output. And they are about 2/3 of the world's global emissions. Right? So they are the most important countries in the world, basically. Yeah. Now, so if you visit these countries, you'll see that they all have aspirations. And their aspirations are to get to high income. Okay? And we think it's a reasonable aspiration. So for example, if you look at this, you see the China 5-year plan, you see India's Viksit Bharat ambitions, and then you see Vietnam, South Africa, every country. Malaysia has the same ambitions, and there's no reason why they shouldn't. Despite what some people say, it's not the right of every country to become a high-income economy. At least we at the World Bank, we think that it is the right, and it is actually that it is possible for every country to become a high-income economy, right? And this was a question that somebody asked Deng Xiaoping, that how do you square this ambition with also being a socialist economy? And that was his response. He says, to get rich is glorious. You should not be trying not to get rich. Okay? Everybody should get rich. All right. But those are the plans. Then if you look at the reality looks something like this. So if you look at the median middle income countries, and if you see what share of what levels of incomes they have attained as a share of US GDP per capita, and you sort of see over here, there hasn't been that much progress over this time. It's still about less than 10% in in gross national income terms. So it's not the case that countries have been, as a matter of course, converging to the frontier of the world, which is the United States. What you see instead is stagnation. Now, it's not the case that countries haven't become high income. There are, of course, countries like Korea and others that have become high income over the last 34 years. In fact, if you look at if you add up the countries, you actually find that about 34 countries have become high income over the last 34 years. So about roughly one per year graduates into them. But then I asked the team to calculate how large these countries are. And you sort of see then that actually the population in these countries is less than 245 million. So okay, that's roughly the size of Pakistan. So imagine if all of the achievement over the last 34 years was that Pakistan became a high-income economy. It would not be something that people would be happy with. Definitely not Indians. I don't think Indians would be happy with it, but I don't think the rest of the world would be happy with it either, right? Okay. And so then you say, okay, so it's difficult to get to high income. So what's the reason for this? So one of the reasons, of course, is that growth appears to slow down when you get to middle income. So there's been a lot of debate about this, lots of discussion about by empirical economists whether or not there is in fact such a slowdown and so on. So we finally calculated it, and I think pretty much once and for all you can look at these numbers. And basically what they show is that when countries get to about 5% to about 25% of US GDP, the likelihood of a slowdown is great. Okay? It's higher than that of a low-income country, and it's 3 times as high as when you get to high income. Okay? So that's the first part. The first part is that growth in middle-income countries is slower, and there's one chapter in the report, which will be released next month, there's one chapter in the report that actually shows all of this stuff. So the second question is, why is it slower? And the most plausible explanation, of course, is that growing through middle income requires a lot of structural changes in the economy, a massive amount. And these structural changes are not easy. So countries that try not to change the structure and say instead, okay, let's just accumulate a lot of human capital through education and things like that, or let's try to accumulate a lot of capital through investment and things like that. Well, that strategy, what it will do is that it increases the amount of endowments per worker. So typically speaking, a country that's just nearing high income, it ends up having the endowments, which is human capital, natural resources, physical capital, and so on, as a share of U.S. Or U.S. endowments per worker. That share is pretty high. It is about 70%. Okay? But if you look at the incomes at that stage, or the output per worker, as compared to that of the United States, it's only about 20% of that of the United States. So if accumulation was all that it took, these countries would be much closer to US per capita incomes than they actually are. They're actually much lower. So the question, of course, is what's the difference? And that difference, that 50 percentage point difference over there, is efficiency. The US is just better organized. It converts all those endowments into output in a more efficient way, both by having more efficient production methods, of course, but also by doing different things in different ways. Right? So that's the second point. So the second point is the problem is that the growth in middle income is actually different. This has lots of implications. One of the implications is that policymakers in middle-income countries have to keep the structural change in mind all the time, during good times and bad. During good times, you should try to expand the economy in ways that the structure keeps changing. During bad times, you have to find a way that not just recover, but also make sure that as you recover with a better structure, because sometimes there are lots of forces that actually prevent you from changing. And the crises are the best time to actually do it. So basically, during this time, what happens is that countries become more complex. I mean, economies become more complex, and as they become more complex, of course, you have to have sharper policies, and you have to. So I'll skip over the next. So here's a very simple way to try to sort of say is, what does all of this mean? Basically, what this means is that when you're talking about a fairly low level of income, like which is on the left side over here, when essentially countries are very far away from the world technology frontier, investment by itself gets you a long way. Okay? It gets you out of low income. The typical country that has gone from low income to lower middle income has engineered twice as many investment accelerations as a country that still is a low income country. So investment takes you a long way. But as you get into middle income or lower middle income, this will not be enough. And what you have to do is you have to start to change the structure. And the most efficient way to change your structure at this point is to actually get new technologies from abroad and diffuse them in your economy. Okay? So we call that importing and diffusion of new technologies to change the structures in your country, we call that infusion. So the second point is you have to continue on the investment side, but now you have to augment it with infusion. And the way that Deng Xiaoping put this was, he said you have to do two things. You have to reform so that you're actually much more open to these new technologies, and then you have to make sure that you open up so that these new technologies flow into your country. New ways of doing things, new goods, etc. Then as you get closer and closer to the production possibility frontier of the world, the returns to this infusion naturally diminish, and you have to sort of switch much more to what we call innovation. Okay? And one of the mistakes that a lot of countries make is that they stick with the innovation-led strategy for too long and try to sort of do this without opening up to the rest of the world. This was the case, for example, in some countries that are generally natural resource-rich countries and so on, and they try to sort of just get by with investment. The second one is there are some countries that try to leapfrog from that strategy of just investment straight to innovation, try to bypass the middle part, because the middle part is a painful part, because it requires a lot of change in society, a lot of people lose their jobs, they have to move jobs, etc., etc. It's painful. Sometimes inequality rises. So to avoid that, a lot of countries, it's not because they are stupid or anything like that, it's just because they want to avoid that pain. And what happens, what you sort of see is that the experience of the world shows no pain, no gain. Okay? So it's very hard to skip that stage. Okay. So this is just a summary of those slides. And so then you sort of see, obviously, so here are some countries that actually did do that, and they did it successfully. So you see Korea, then you see Poland over there, and you see Chile. If you look at Korea and Taiwan, for example, and so on, which looks more like Korea than like those other two countries, you actually find that back in the 1980s or so, they had the same per capita income as Malaysia, right? And what has happened now is, if you look at Malaysia's per capita income now, it's somewhat lower than that of Chile, right? Somewhere there. So essentially what has happened is that Malaysia's per capita income has not increased nearly as much, even though it's firmly in the ranks of upper middle income economies. And by the way, infusion is a very deliberate process. It just doesn't happen by accident. So here are some slides that actually show you. So that's a picture of the Samsung team in Japan at the NEC TV factory and so on, trying to learn how to actually make TVs better. And what you see on the right-hand slide is that the South Korean government actually gave what you would call infusion subsidies in a very deliberate way. They actually encouraged companies to do this. And then what you found was, of course, they were very successful at this. And very soon, Samsung started to compete with NEC and others. So it became harder and harder to do this because NEC started to charge more and more, make it more far more difficult. Around that time, South Korea switched, at least in this sector, it switched to innovation subsidies, which is the green line down there, and tried to sort of encourage Samsung and others to actually improve the quality of their TVs and so on to stay competitive with NEC. So, I mean, here's an example of how essentially a deliberate strategy, I think. Generally speaking, what happens at this stage also is that many of the skilled people, even if a country invests a lot in human capital and so on, some of them actually leave the country because it turns out that their skills are better matched to their economic activities in some other place. So this is an example from Poland. And when Poland opened up, for example, a lot of educated Poles actually left Poland and went to other parts of Western Europe and so on. It turns out that because of Poland's strategy succeeded, they started to catch up to the Western European countries, and a lot of this human capital has actually come back. Okay? And this is a success story. This is a story of success that you see repeated in many countries. Some of them are still middle-income countries, but many of them have actually taken advantage of this diaspora that at a time when they really needed talent, and it was very difficult to actually build more talent because it takes time, one of the sources of talent was actually the diaspora. Okay. All right, so I skip a few slides and tell you. Here's a slide of Brazil, which tried to sort of skip that stage of infusion. And what you see over there is that Brazil's workers were as productive as those of Korea's, and they were about 40% as productive as those of the United States. And then fast forward to 2020, and you see that the typical Korean worker is about 60% as productive as that of a United States worker. And then what you sort of see is that the typical Brazilian worker is now 25% as productive as a US worker. Okay? So, and by the way, during this time, Brazil's economic inequality went up and so on. So all those fears that prompted it to try to leapfrog over innovation actually came back to hurt it. They actually did not avoid that pain anyway. They just prolonged it. Okay. Now, if you sort of look at, so the first two chapters of the report say growth in middle income is slower. The second chapter says growth in middle income is different, and that's the reason why it necessitates a different strategy. The third part, the third chapter says, is the future going to be easier than the past? Are countries that are still middle income today, is their life going to be easier or harder than countries that were there in the past? And the answer, if you look at this, these are two slides. One shows that the external headwinds have increased. So one thing that has happened is that trade was a big part of the strategy to get out of the middle income trap, to actually open up and so on, trade with other countries, import capital from there. That those trade spaces are getting restricted because of greater superpower rivalry, other things, and so on. But the main point is that the number of trade restrictive measures that are being undertaken has more than tripled over the last 3 or 4 years. Okay? So that's one. The second one, of course, is that another part of the success of countries like Korea and others was cheap and reliable, affordable energy. And that space is getting restricted too because of global climate change and things like that. Because of that, what's happening is that the energy space is getting restricted. So the trade space getting energy space. So these are the external headwinds. Domestically, there are some headwinds too. The first one is, over the last 5 or 6 years, a lot of middle-income countries have emerged from the crises of the past with much higher public debt to GDP ratios, much higher private debt to GDP ratios. Public debt, when this is very high, it means that the space for the structural reforms, like I told you, the aim is to change the structures. Because it is painful, what happens is that public spending can actually help ease that pain. That space has diminished too, because now you have higher levels of debt, much less fiscal space. And then finally, also related to this is the fact that many countries, many middle-income countries have aging populations. And aging populations do create problems, not necessarily in labor, because you can always extend the retirement age a little bit and so on, but because of entrepreneurship. Older people tend not to be good entrepreneurs. Younger people tend to be better entrepreneurs. Okay? It's not always the case. I'm sure there are some elderly people over here who are fantastic entrepreneurs. But somebody like me is far less likely to be an entrepreneur as compared to a younger person. And so that's another thing. Okay? So for all of those reasons, it's going to be very, very difficult. So we say, okay, what should these countries do? In a word, what these countries have to do is become very efficient. They have to increase their efficiency. It goes back to that chart. You remember the 21-71 chart and so on. You just have to become more efficient. So what the report does is says, are there insights on how to become more efficient? Okay? And what it tries to do is it tries to take the foundations that we have on how to develop and so on, and we add one set of new developments that have taken place over the last 30 or 40 years. These are the advances in thinking about creative destruction. And the reason why we picked this is because we actually find there are lots of features about this that are very relevant for the problem at hand, which is a very difficult problem. For one thing, this is built on Schumpeterian creative destruction. Schumpeter actually looked not just at economic issues, but at social and political issues too. And he tried to sort of formulate an idea of what it takes to manage all three of these things. His book was called Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy, all three things. Okay? So that's the first thing that we try to do. The second thing we then try to do is try to sort of say, has this theory been formalized? And the answer is yes, it's been formalized about 30 years ago by people like Philippe Aghion, who I suspect will actually win a Nobel Prize this year. Okay? And so he has actually formalized this. Okay? Then it turns out that there are people who have come since Philippe Aghion who've actually developed this theory much more so that it fits the facts better. Okay? So for example, in Philippe Aghion's formulation of the world, all of new ideas or structural change and all comes from new entrants, the small firms that enter, they change the industry. The big firms then exit. In the case of the latest iteration of this theory, those unrealistic conditions are actually relaxed, and you find that it's not just small firms, it's also large firms that actually help to change the structure. And it's not the case that when a new entrant comes in, the firms that exist must necessarily exit. It's not the case. Okay? So these are the three stages of development of this theory. And it turns out, by the way, that when we look at these three factors, the first factor is capital, the second factor is talent, and then the third factor is energy. When we look at this, we find that actually Schumpeterian analysis fits the market for energy, or fits the structure of energy markets pretty well. The Aghion and how one fits the social parts pretty well. And the third part actually fits the enterprise pretty well. Okay? So for example, over here, in terms of enterprises, you actually find that, so here's an example from India, that actually you find that it's not just the new entrants that actually bring more employment or more exports and more change and so on. You actually find it's also the incumbents who do it, right? I just skipped that slide otherwise. Then, if you find that so it's not the case always that incumbents are good. Sometimes incumbents are not good, okay? So here's a case study from Italy that actually shows that a lot of the big incumbents, they don't invest in new technology, they invest in new contacts. So they put politicians on their boards and so on, and that's the way that they survive. But you need case studies like this to show what the problem is. Okay? And what you'll see in the report is that these case studies are possible and they're necessary. Okay? So the main point that comes out of all of this stuff is don't focus too much on the size of enterprises. Focus, or don't look at their age, or don't look at their ownership. Is it state? Is it mixed? Is it private? And so on. Those are relatively superficial characteristics. What you really want to identify is whether or not these firms are adding value. Are they converting inputs into outputs in a great, more and more efficient way every year? It turns out you can measure that. It's a term called value added. Everybody knows about it. I know that the Prime Minister of Malaysia actually has talked about this for the last 30 years. Okay? So time to measure those things well. And, and wherever possible, stop relying on superficial measures. They lead you astray. Because if you think that big firms are bad and small firms are good, you'll be wrong more than half the time. Okay? All right. Of course, the second thing is that the second thing that happens is now, move from enterprises, move to people and talent. Okay? Now, the problem with middle-income countries is that they have smaller pools of talent than high-income countries do. Just take a look, for example, go to the United States or go to Australia and you find universities around the corner, every corner, right? And you find, so they actually have far greater talent than middle-income countries. It turns out they're also actually much better at allocating talent to tasks than middle-income countries. So middle-income countries, of course, they're trying to catch up on the talent part. That'll take years. But to allocate talent to tasks better is a quicker thing to do. And so they must do this because as soon as they hit these talent constraints, they have to find ways to improve the allocation of talent. So here's a case over here. If you look at that green line over there, so that green line there says, what would be US GDP as compared to 100 in 1960, what it would be in 2010 if discrimination against women and discrimination against minorities were the same as 1960 levels. And the answer is that it would have gone up. It would have gone up from about 100 to about 160. But it turns out that in the 70s, the US actually did a lot of reforms. They actually had anti-discrimination legislation against women, against minorities, and so on. And you see those lines diverged in the 70s. And those lines have diverged so much that if you sort of look at it now, US GDP today overall is at 220 or 230 instead of 160. That difference between those two is the amount of money middle-income countries are leaving on the table by not allocating task to talent better. So they have to do that. The other way, of course, for them to get more talent is to get much smarter about the diaspora. So you find that countries like China and Taiwan and Korea and even India and others have become much cleverer about it. And you actually find that they're starting to reap the benefits of these diaspora. That's the thing. And of course, you need to continue to invest in STEM education and things like that. But remember, that'll always take a little bit more time. Then there's a third part. And the third part has to do with the energy. So it has to do with the energy transition. In the energy transition, actually, this one looks a lot like Schumpeter's theory that you have incumbents actually gang up on the entrants. So in this case, if you think about it, the stereotypical middle-income country has a large part of their energy sector is dominated by state-owned enterprises. This is not the case in high-income economies, by the way. Okay? And then you find that all of the new technologies that are coming in, the more efficient technologies and so on, are actually private sector technologies. And until now, at least, SOEs have done a pretty good job of keeping these technologies out. Okay? So basically what we say is, based on all of this thinking, you need to make 3 shifts. The first shift that you need to make is, don't focus on superficial measures of firms, like their size, like their age, like their ownership structure. It's easy to do it. It's also lazy to do it. Okay? and it'll lead you wrong. Other countries can afford it. Middle-income countries cannot afford to make this mistake because of all the reasons that I mentioned to you. They have to get much more efficient at allocating capital. Okay, that's the first one. Instead of that, go to the variable that really matters, which is the value added of this firm. That will not lead you astray. So if you want to reward firms that add more value, if you want to do industrial policy, you better know that. If you base industrial policy on superficial characteristics, like whether a firm is exporting or not, or whether a firm is old or small or whatever, okay, you will most likely go astray. That's the first. The second transition is you want to allocate talent to task better. And if you want to do this and you start to sort of focus on a measure that you think is right, which is inequality, that will lead you wrong too, because inequality has two sides to it. One of it is, of course, it increases efficiency, and the other one is it actually reduces fairness. Okay? Sometimes it can reduce inefficiency too, sometimes it can increase inefficiency. You don't know that. But if you look at socioeconomic mobility, the likelihood that people move up and down, that won't lead you wrong. That'll keep you. And then the third thing, on the energy side, you have to, we become obsessed with whether, is it clean energy? Is it like solar? Is it wind? Is it coal, gas? Those are bad things. These things. Ultimately, what prompted all of this thing was the fact that emissions were rising. So what you really want to do is you want to see is whether or not a country is getting more efficient at converting energy into output. And the best way to measure that is to look at the emissions intensity of output. Why look at all these other things? Go directly to the thing that you really want to actually change. So that's what you need to do. The great thing is this: when you switch from the sources of energy to emissions intensity, you naturally focus first and foremost on energy efficiency. If you look at just the sources of energy, you have to tag on the part about energy. If you look only at the sources of energy, like whether it's solar or wind or coal or thing, you don't think about efficiency nearly as much. But you want to think about efficiency first. You want to make these economies more efficient. So these are changes in thinking. To me, this looks self-evident, but you would not believe how much pushback we got on all three of these things at the World Bank. For many reasons. We often base our lending based on those kind of indicators on firm size and so on. Second one, there's a whole entrenched lobby that says inequality is bad, especially countries that are developed. They always sort of say, oh, our inequality levels are so low, but China's inequality is rising and India's inequality is rising. If you want concessional assistance, you better work on that. Okay? And the answer is no, work on socioeconomic mobility. And then the third part, of course, is on the sources of energy and so on. It's become a religion. It should not be a religion. It's a technical problem. Okay. I've taken a long time, so I'm going to, so these all just prove all the points that I just made. They prove them rigorously. Okay. Yeah. Okay. All right. I'm just going to keep going on. Yeah. So then if you go back to Schumpeter's creative destruction, basically what you find is that the status quo in many of these countries is the forces of creation are not always weak, but they're not particularly strong. The forces of destruction are actually rather weak in these countries, and the forces of preservation are very strong. There's a status quo bias to things and so on. And what you really sort of want to do is somehow you want policy, you want to look at the nature of policy, the changes in institutions, the timing of policy changes and so on. You want to do that in a way that your forces look like the right, a more balanced set of forces that actually help countries go through that 1I, 2I, 3I transition more smoothly. It'll never be super smooth, but it'll be smoother, it'll be faster if you do it like that than if you try to do it like that, okay? So then you say, okay, how does one do that? And here's the other slide that actually needs to be basically implemented. The first one is don't vilify incumbents, whether these incumbents are large firms, whether these incumbents are the elites, or whether these incumbents are state-owned enterprises, connected enterprises and people. Don't vilify them, because you're going to need them. Many of them add value. Some of them don't, many of them do. So you have to find ways to discipline that incumbency, not to vilify it. Okay? That's the first one. The second one is that when it comes to you want to reward merit activities. That's what we call merit activities, whether that's individual merit or whether that's social merit. So if you find that there's an activity like the participation of women in the labor force that has social benefits as well, you have to encourage that. You have to reward it. Okay? So that's the second part. And then the third part, of course, like I told you, the forces of preservation are very strong. It turns out they're the weakest during crises. So you have to find, so basically for a middle-income country, a crisis it's not just trying to just keep a crisis short. You should try to keep it short. It's not just that you should try to keep it shallow. You should try to keep it shallow. But you should emerge from the crisis. You should emerge from the crisis with a very different set of structures than you do. So if you talk to racing car drivers, for example, they always have a rule. They say it's always slow in and fast out of a turn. Okay, you always go into a turn slow and you leave a turn fast. Okay, and it's tattooed in their brains. I think middle-income country policymakers have to tattoo in their brains saying, structurally old in, structurally new out. Okay, you've got to do it like that. And like I said over here, is that if you sort of look at this, you actually find that for things like enterprise, it is really about disciplining incumbency. Of course, it's about those other two things too, but it's really the big challenge is that one. When it comes to talent, it is about rewarding merit activities. Otherwise, you're leaving a lot of growth on the table. Okay? A lot of growth on the table. I would conjecture that different policies in Malaysia on those things, on rewarding talent and so on, would have led to as much of a change in GDP as you saw in the United States between 1970 and today, at least as much as compared to today, right? And then finally, in the case of energy, it is really about capitalizing on crises because the incumbents are very, very strong, but they are the weakest at a certain point in time. Whether that's a genuine climate crisis or whether that's some other crisis like a fiscal crisis, because sometimes there's a fiscal crisis too, but you have to use those things to weaken this. I know I've taken too long, but there's lots of things about how best to do these things. As you can sort of see, how do you discipline incumbency and so on. The report will be made available very, very soon, and I'll make the slides available too very quickly. Lots of discussions about the how-tos of these things. And then if you look at how do you sort of, how do you reward merit more and so on, right? You should not be rewarding firms to stay small, for example, right? And similarly, on the forces of talent accumulation and people. And then using your resources well. So here's this lady, I'm trying to remember her name. So she is, her name is Yan, Nin Yan, right? Right there. So she was a professor at Princeton in microbiology. And what has happened is that she was brought back to China. Sorry to see that. She was actually brought back to China, and now she heads up. She heads up a research center in Shenzhen, I think, which has about 100 PhDs and a multi-billion-dollar grant from the government and so on. And I'm sure that she's going to work wonders. But these are the kind of quote-unquote industrial policies that actually can work. Okay? And you see this in India, you see this in China, you see this in many other countries. There's no reason why you shouldn't see it in Malaysia. You should see it in Malaysia too. Right. And so we actually get into a whole lot of these things about how can mix be successful in reducing emissions at home. So I've given you a very sort of general picture of all of these things. It's actually a lot richer when you look at the report. In part, I have not conveyed the richness of the report because I was not an author of the report. I'm just an overall supervisor of the report. But in part, it is also because I'm short of time and this is just after lunch and I can see some of you, your eyelids are getting droopy. Yeah? But to conclude, so here's a slide over here, which is called Making Miracles. And this was when Bob Lucas, who was a professor at the University of Chicago, he passed away last year, when he got the Nobel Prize. I think it was the mid-90s, was it? 92. It was in the early 92. And the reason why I asked Apurv was because Apurv was in that room. He was actually a student at the University of Chicago back then. Why did I put him there? Around that time, just after that, I think in 93, Bob Lucas published a paper called Making a Miracle. Okay, and it was about South Korea. Well, the reason why I picked this slide was because I have to tell you that middle-income countries today, given the changes at home, given the changes abroad, given the record of middle-income countries to get to high income, given the things that countries have to do to get through middle income quickly and so on, getting to high income today is like making a miracle. And in order for you to make that miracle, you just have to do one thing. You just have to read the World Development Report 2024. There you go. Stop. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Gill, for the insightful presentation. And so we will now begin with the panel discussion, which would help us unpack some of the points in the lecture and consider their relevance to Malaysia. I would now introduce and invite our distinguished panelists onto the stage. First, I would like to invite Yang Berhormat Liew Chen Tong, the Deputy Minister of Investment, Trade and Industry. We then have Dr.Indermit Gill himself. Next on the panel, we have Datuk Sri Idris Jalal, former Minister and CEO of Pemandu. Next, I would like to invite Puan Nurul Izzah Anwar, former Member of Parliament and currently the Chairperson for Social and Economic Research Institute, Surrey. Last but not least, I would like to invite Dr. Apurva Sangi, Lead Country Economist for Malaysia from the World Bank, to join the panel up on stage. I would now like to pass the chair to renowned morning radio presenter, Ms. Wong Shao Ning, to moderate the panel discussion. The floor is yours, Shao Ning.
Can you all hear me? Is it clear? Yeah, okay. We've had a very excellent presentation for Indermit, and I would say if it was only so easy to escape our middle income trap and all we had to do was just read the World Development Report, I think there are many, many steps for us to actually become a high income nation. But first off...
It's a very long report and it's very difficult. It's like it's written by World Bank people. So it would be a miracle if you read it, yeah.
I heard it's a few hundred pages at least. Okay, we will attempt to do so. But we're going to have a panel discussion now. And as usual, I always have some house rules. So we're going to start with a rapid fire round for all the panelists. This will then be followed by a series of questions. And because I see a very full room, we do want it to be as interactive as possible. So we're going to have 2 rounds of questions from the audience. Mics will be available. We just have an hour for this, a quick, short hour. So let's keep our questions short And a reminder for our panelists to also keep their answers succinct. And because I'm a big believer in keeping things lively, if any panelist wants to add a comment or ask a question, just raise your hands. It should be as interactive and enjoyable as possible. So with that, let's start with a rapid fire round, and I'm going to keep time. I've got my phone. So in a minute or less, can we please have what left you with perhaps the biggest impression or maybe surprised you most from Indermit's presentation? And I know I'm not supposed to start with you, Chin Tong, but I'm going to. So what took you by surprise, or what is the biggest takeaway?
First of all, thank you, Shanning. Thank you, Indermit, and Tan Sri Idris, Isa, Approval, friends. Malaysia was the chief example of the word coined by you, middle income trap. Since the word is coined, we are stuck with it. Secondly, I'm not sure whether we should talk about creative destruction, because the last time someone talked about creative destruction in 1997, he went to jail in 1998. The guy was called Anwar Ibrahim. The third point I would like to make is that you say that you first came in 1994. 1994, the finance minister was Anwar Ibrahim. Now, finance minister is also Anwar Ibrahim. The point is that actually you're absolutely right. We are stuck with the same question. In 1994, the question was to be South Korea or Taiwan. We are very much now stuck with the same question. Whether we can be almost like South Korea or Taiwan in terms of technology, in terms of getting out of middle income trap. So I found a shortcut. The shortcut is to at least reposition Malaysia in the minds of policymakers, in the minds of our public, in the minds of investors. That is to at least to ask the question and to reposition ourselves. Because for the longest of time, people in this country and also investors, they're thinking that we are competing with Vietnam. At least in the last 10, 15 years. And many people think that we are Vietnam plus. I think at the least, before we touch the question of South Korea or Taiwan, we must see ourselves at the least as Singapore at a discount.
Okay.
But from there, I think it's important that we deal with the questions of how to reposition Malaysia, to deal with the question of wages, to deal with the questions of technology acquisition.
I'm going to
ring
the bell, Chin Tong.
I'll do the second round. But I just want to leave you with a question. We are still dealing with the question of whether we are able to catch up with Korea and Taiwan. We must reposition our mindset. At the least, we are Singapore at a discount, and we should move up.
Okay. Dr. Sri, just your views.
Yeah, three things that came out. First, the comment that he said that for middle-income countries to graduate, it's much harder than it used to be. That's one. The second one is that he talks about the need for them to move into phases. Investment in phase one, investment plus infusion, and investment plus infusion and innovation. One thing that the third comment was, that was clear, and the third one was quite surprising for me if you just look at that. The one thing that's common in all three phases is investment, investment, investment. So if you don't have investment in any of the three phases, you aren't going to make it. So you have to infuse it. The point about infusion, he also did mention also, it's risky business.
Yeah.
Risky road.
Nurul?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi and very good afternoon. Thank you, Shanning. Thank you, everyone, and the panelists, Dr. Indermit. I think the three things that actually struck me as we enter our 20th year since the term middle income trap was first coined, is the fact that trade policies, it's not just helpful, it can be harmful. And I think it's important to understand the nuances and differences. Number two is evidence shows, as the graph earlier kind of depicted, you generally decarbonize after you reach high income level. So I think as you industrialize, you actually will emit greenhouse gases. So this crazy kind of charging towards net zero, perhaps we can be a bit more cognizant as to what it entails. And number three, you looked at the Vietnam socio-economic development strategy. There was the South Africa's 2030 National Development Plan, Malaysia's own new industrial master plan. It goes back to kind of a departure from the Washington consensus, because industrialization is hip, it's sexy, but it's not just these countries who are, which are employing it. It's also America. The Inflation Reduction Act, making sure that the government now is intervening, subsidizing, introducing higher tariff imports, right, to block the entry of, I would probably say, other possible challenges. So that's quite interesting, because it means going back to, having a clear-cut agenda for a state to justify, whether Danny Roderick always says, state intervention was very crucial in Southeast Asia's economic success.
Yeah.
So for me, the last point in all of this is, even though things look kind of bleak, 20 years later, we actually have a lot more evidence, suggestions, interest, and studies by the likes of South Korean economists, Ha Jun-chang and Keon Lee. And Ha Jun-chang's main premise, which goes back to Dr. Sri Idris Jala's point on FDI, investments are not always good. And sometimes you got to kick the ladder, because the ladder is sometimes being used to block the growth of new entrants. And I think Dr. Indermit also pushed this. And that's why it's important to not just rely on conventional wisdom. And it's a great opportunity to kind of learn from South Korea, China, but through a step-by-step approach to ensure not just Malaysia. I mean, there's only 35 nations, right, in 35 years that have done it. So, I feel that there's a lot of hope left, but we need to make sure we take stock and learn from existing studies. Thank you.
Okay, Apurva, your turn. Any comments on your colleagues' work?
Oh, my colleagues' work. I feel invested in this report, infused with enthusiasm, and inspired to innovate. Yeah. But there are a few things that surprised me. And before I get to that, Indermit, you had a very nice quote by Deng Xiaoping, "To get rich is glorious," which reminded me of what somebody said once, that capitalism is an obsession with money. Socialism is an obsession with other people's money. So to get rich is glorious, I think, Deng. I know they're really going to come back to me at that. That's fine. So the three things that surprised me. The first thing that surprised me was an economist, that to a World Bank economist, actually presented something that was engaging and thought-provoking. The first thing that surprised me. The second thing that surprised me was that there was no mention at all of the little red dot south of Johor. Like Voldemort will not be named. But this little red dot became high income even before the World Bank started tabulating high income statistics. And you talked about social mobility. If you look at the Global Social Mobility Index put out by the World Economic Forum, this little red dot is the only country in the top 20 from Southeast Asia to be there. So that's the second thing. You spoke a lot about Korea and Taiwan, etc., but not about the little red dot. And the third thing that surprised me was, and this is a positive surprise, the focus on carbon intensity over absolute emissions. I think that's a very important one. Because here's an interesting fact. No country has ever become high income by lowering emissions. So worth repeating, no country has joined the high income club while lowering emissions. So this focus, the shift of focus from absolute emissions target to carbon intensity is a very surprising one. And I can totally understand the pushback you must have gotten from the board. And like Nurul, I agree that it's good for countries like Malaysia to think about it. It gives them more space to use natural gas as a transition for that. So these are the three things I think that has surprised me.
Okay, so you didn't throw your colleague under the bus yet, but never mind, maybe later. Okay, we're gonna, with that, back to you, Chin Tong. So the round of questions begin.
I find the echo really quite bad here. Can you please do something with that? I really can't hear it.
I know you may have to put your...
Can you hear us though? Because I don't know. Yeah, I can't.
The echo is a problem.
Okay, can the team try and do something about it? In the meantime, I hope you all can hear me. Is the room clear? Can you all hear me? Okay, so the room can hear. So Chin Tong, first question for you. To achieve productivity, yes, we do need investments. Dr. Sri Idris pointed that out. There's investments that go along with every stage, be it in fusion and innovation. And I think we do see that, especially in the recently launched National Semiconductor Strategy. So I'm going to use that as a most recent example. So there's a lot of emphasis on FDI, 500 billion in investments. But I wonder whether enough is being done for the other two I's, which is the infusion and innovation. Because how do we ensure that our local players, the ecosystem, also move up the value chain and encourage that technological transfer, like the classic example that Indermit uses of South Korea? Otherwise, we will still always be that low-cost producing country.
Yeah, thank you, Shaning. I agree with you. In the Prime Minister's speech, when he launched the National Semiconductor Strategy, while there was mention of investment, particularly in the hope of having investment via FDI into fab, there was also a very strong emphasis on domestic, creating domestic champions. He mentioned that there are 10 Malaysian companies which are at the moment, technology companies, which are at the moment at around 1 billion ringgit revenue. And he hopes that within the foreseeable future, perhaps 7 to 10 years, they will become $1 billion in revenue. He also mentioned that we want to see another 100 companies, semiconductor-related companies, reaching a billion ringgit in the same period of time. I think there is recognition that over the last 20, 30 years, we have depended on foreign investment. We have depended on a strategy that is FDI driven, but very firm level, very dependent on firm without looking at the ecosystem, without having a strong localization policy, without creating strong local champions. There are still some very interesting companies. If you visit some of the tech companies, Malaysian tech companies in Penang, you realize that they are really good. But it is not yet widespread. And what we want is widespread. What we want is a lot more localization, and we want a systemic change to the scene. But that would require us to now acknowledge that it is not just FDI, but there needs to be technological transfer, there needs to be local champion, and there also needs to be a new realization that we cannot be dependent on cheap labor, we cannot continue to be this vicious cycle of low wage, low productivity, and low cost. We have to price ourselves higher as a nation. Therefore, not to be a Vietnam plus, but Singapore at a discount.
Okay. Dr. Idris, question for you. So,
Same question.
no, different. Everybody gets a slightly different question. And I'm going to use your experience because you've done private sector. You've also managed one of Malaysia's most well-known GLCs. And of course, you advise firms now on transformation. So in Malaysia's case, let's talk about incumbents, okay, which prevent entrance. And here in Malaysia, I want to be honest, sometimes they are government-linked companies. So can we get them an entrance, smaller private firms, not necessarily small, but medium-sized, to work together to add value? Do they, when you talk to GLC bosses or management, do they have the mindset to accept infusion and innovation to add value, or are they just, happy to keep the status quo, not be the most efficient?
I think let's begin with the statement made by our speaker earlier on, Indermit, he mentioned that don't vilify the incumbent.
That's true.
And he began by saying that, so you take what is good at the GLCs, what they brought in, you have to then create a new game. I think if I return back to the point that was made before, Malaysia started very well with our FDIs in Penang, in those places. But we started the infusion. We brought a lot of FDIs there, but we spent so long time in the infusion phase. We were just doing assembly. Then we went out, spent all the time to do manufacturing of core component parts. The real money is in the intellectual property.
Yeah, and design.
That's where the design work, that's the money. We stayed put there. We did not innovate. We didn't move out from infusion into the innovation sphere. That's why when we started that game, we were in the same league at the same time as Taiwan. Same thing as Korea, but they've jumped because they didn't stay put. They didn't get stuck in the infusion phase because they brought in the innovation. So in the same way, my take on the GLCs today is that GLCs played a very big part in the early part of the development of the country. That's very good. But I think we should now encourage the GLCs to graduate into play a part in the infusion, plus much more in the innovation sphere. If I look around this room, how many of the things out here are manufactured in Malaysia? I'm pretty sure this is not. My watch is not. Everything that we wear today is not made in Malaysia. And so I think we really have to think about figuring out how the GLCs can play a part in the innovation sphere, not building roads, no longer doing all the stuff that was before.
Old economy, just
So
focusing,
I think
right?
this is key. Government need to the point that he made about before, infusion plus innovation subsidy. We need to put in the subsidy for innovation so that a lot of this can happen. So I think there is a part that can be played for the JLCs to move into a different sphere, not the old way in which we used to do it before.
Okay. Nurul, yes.
I actually liked this bit because if you look at the comparison and how Penang had developed, and of course we've been relatively very successful, but it's still very much providing human capital for multinationals in the viewpoint of Keon Lee, right? Compare it to Shenzhen, right? And there you have big businesses, they really have kind of taken a lead in the innovative frontier. So drilling down a little bit when you talk about from the diffusion stage, I think it's not that Malaysia hasn't subsidized different sectors, we have. And I think a lot of us here have been very critical on this matter, but I just want to take a look at the analog technology, analog television, which Japan was spearheading, and how South Korea actually made the decision not to compete, but they picked, comparatively, it was better to develop on the digital technology, especially for production of televisions and so on and so forth. And I think this kind of detailed comparison, because at the end of the day, the devil is in the details, right? Yeah. You can have this great ambition, a grand plan to make sure you develop further, but if you don't make the right informed, evidence-based choices, then definitely you will lose out.
Which also goes back to Indermit's point, right, where we need to ensure that we are looking at things with the right lens. The data is correct. We're not going down this false path of assuming that what we have or base our assumptions are correct. So to constantly check that. I know that's Apurva's point. In Malaysia, we collect a lot of data, but we don't necessarily do very much with it. But Nurul, I want to come back to you. Yes, you have a question, because I think for there to be total efficiency, and we haven't talked so much about this, but it's a big part of Indermit's slides, is that we need to also have that talent, right? And I think we all agree in the room that education is critical for that. But in Malaysia, I would say that there is unequal access to it. And on many levels, we have it from race, gender, household income, access to technology. We've got better schools, and then we have the whole list that goes on. And even today, we're still seeing this debate on the dual language program. It's still resonating, it's still contentious. So is there a solution that will not be politicized so that we can ensure that really there's equal access to education for all?
So Shoning, I think one of the things that we have to take stock of is the fact that on record, Malaysia suffered 2 years of school closure during the pandemic. So the ASEAN Development Bank kind of tracked what were the key factors that had to be addressed. So, you're recovering, you're leaving the pandemic, but there's no new normal. There's no normal. There's no going back to the years before the pandemic. You will have to grapple with that you have this huge, lost generation that you have to help, assist, encourage to kind of get back and be part of the ecosystem. Now, we did a study on multidimensional poverty index. Tokpa was kind enough to launch it, but it was at the height of COVID in 2021, where we measured not just in terms of how much savings they had after income, but we measured accessibility to online education. So if it was a struggle for a school kid in the urban centers, imagine in the more kind of deeper heartland, right?
Yes.
Because one iPad, or if you're lucky, or one kind of handphone shared amongst 4 siblings. And then you discover for single-headed households, there's intergenerational poverty. Kid number 4 is worse off. Usually wants to stay with grandma and has decided, maybe I don't want to go back to school, right? So that's why for me, the government's decision to also focus on investing in TVET, technical and vocational schools, is important. It's important because you have to understand, once they start working, if they're in the informal sector, there's a really low likelihood they suddenly wake up one day and I want to go to university, right? It's already challenging having to go through Form 3, Form 4, Form 5, imagine. So I think that focus on TVET is important.
Yes.
Just make sure how you can guide them so they will experience some degree of career and social mobility. But for universities, now when Dr. Indermit mentioned, right, universities, one thing that struck me is the fact that for all the countries, especially in East Asia, that has succeeded in escaping MIT, they have clear-cut investment, 30% on average, this is for China. 30% R&D, and they will rely on the local academia, local university. There's that demand whereby academia, your work is to produce patents. You can start with utility models. I mean, you don't have to jump straight to with patents because we all know how challenging the IPR regime is, especially by the incumbents. There's so much suits against South Korean companies. There's so much suit going back and forth, right? But then they try to circumvent it through this engagement with academia, local students, graduates, as well as making sure they link up to joint ventures. So they circumvent that whole IPR challenge. And this happens, BYD had their first JV with Daimler, if I'm not mistaken, more than 10 years ago. So I think the way they look at academia, the way we look at our human capital, it cannot be one size fits all. It has to be from the lens of empathy. Okay, you understand these are your challenge, all right? You live in Alostar, definitely, school closure 2 years. What do you do with that particular segment? But at every single moment, maybe we should give less emphasis and time, media space on racialized discussions. I know it's not easy, I understand this, but I think it's also important to push back and state that these are the different types and segments who are in need of clear-cut intervention, support, and not just government. Because, and I'll end with this point, 94 out of our 10,000 schools are actually powered by our various yayasans, right? They're called trust schools. The CSOs are the ones that are providing the curriculum input. But why only 94, right? Now I think the trick or the challenge is to make sure you embrace it as a whole of nation kind of revolution to embark on this strengthening human capital, and the government cannot do it alone.
So public and private partnerships, all of society approach.
Not all private lah, these are TSOs. They're the nicer private people.
Indermit, I have a question for you, because I looked at the slides, and I get the sense where it seems to be very focused on firms, on individuals. Why is that the starting point for this whole, soon to be released WDR? Is that the best route to escape the middle income trap? Is it not grounded on industrial policy?
Okay, so I don't know any other way. That's the thing. I think we tend to talk about enterprise. We think that's a very important part of things. We talk about firms. We talk about households, and we talk about individuals, families, and so on. These are the foundations of any. These are the foundations of any society. No, so that's the thing. But I think that from the conversation here, especially what Nurul is saying, I think the thinking that I had about Malaysia was that you have this sort of a really good foundation of a peaceful society. You have a really good foundation of a diversified economy. But if you have such a good foundation and you become too possessive about just those two things, and you don't build on top of that, sort of say, I want to become a more innovative society. So I want to become a more, so I want to make, so I want to be an advanced economy now. I want to be a developed country. I think basically what you really do need to add is that I would conjecture that if we sort of look at measures of efficiency of the country, so it has lots of human resources, it has lots of natural resources, it has lots of investment over time and so on. What it doesn't have is efficiency. So then the question is, some of the things that Nurul was saying is that you need to probably rethink some of those things, in the sense of saying, are those things helping the efficiency or are they holding it back? I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't know Malaysia well enough. But I think one of the things I would say is that when you talk about subsidies, for example, so if one tries to sort of give subsidies to firms that we think, subsidies is part of industrial policy. It is a highly information-intensive activity. If you do it without information, you will most likely make things less efficient, not more efficient. So if you feel you have that information, then go ahead and try to do this. But from the sense that I get, I think that Malaysia has to invest more in that. That's the first part. The second one is when it comes to innovation, right? Now, innovation means that you actually create a climate that is not just one which is not just of a good investment climate, but a bit more than that. I don't know what that means for Malaysia, but I suspect that it requires some thinking about what would it be to sort of attract more innovative activities, or the innovative activities that you do have, you keep them. They don't disappear off the thing. One last thing. I think a very important part of this has to be, because I know that Malaysia has a very vibrant, so I know that Malaysia has a very vibrant diaspora.
Yes.
All over the world. When I talk to Malaysians abroad, even if they want to come back to the region, they want to come back to Singapore, they don't want to come back to Malaysia. Why is that the case? So I think one needs to ask these questions. It's a peaceful country, it is such a beautiful country, you have wonderful people around. Why aren't they coming over here? The only way, the only logical answer is government policy. There's something wrong with government policy. You've got to change it. It's much easier to change government policy than to change the culture of a people. So in that sense, Malaysia is ahead, right? Yeah.
I was going to ask Dr. Idris Jalil that exact question. We'll come back to you in a minute, but Apurva first, I want the hard facts, and you're going to give it to us. When will Malaysia actually achieve high-income nation status? Does this increasingly polarized world make that journey, which Indermit has highlighted, much harder? And even if we do succeed, can we maintain that status?
Okay, Xiaoning, those are 3 questions. But let me attempt answering them quickly. So the first one, on when would Malaysia reach high income? Every year we do this exercise, and as per the last time we did this exercise, which we'll be redoing next month, by the way, it should reach high income by 28, 29, so another 4-5 years. But that's beside the point. When it reaches is not as important. But just as a small aside, these calculations are quite technical, by the way, and one shouldn't get too carried away. And one of the factors that determines the high income threshold and when Malaysia would reach it is actually the Malaysian ringgit US dollar exchange rate. I don't know if this is a hard fact, but it's a fun fact. Just yesterday, we did these calculations, backward envelope calculations, and found out that had the ringgit exchange rate, USD exchange, had it been 4 ringgit to a dollar, had it been maintained at 4 ringgit to a dollar at 2020, Malaysia would have reached high income today. And instead of in the meet here, we would have Michelle Yeoh cutting a ribbon celebrating Malaysia's graduation to high income.
Okay. But unfortunately, we know the ringgit against US dollar is 4.7, 4.72.
Right. But that's on the side. The second question on trade, I think Indermit has touched upon it. The trade headwinds do make life difficult. But it's important to note that thanks to Malaysia's excellent management of the geopolitics, right now it is gaining from both sides of the trade war. And Chin Tong has been quite articulate about it, and I'm sure he would like to say more about it if he wishes. But if this trade fragmentation gets really out of control, right now you don't see it in the numbers, but if it goes full-blown, then Malaysia may still be getting a larger share of the pie, but the overall pie would be shrinking. Right? So that's where I think the risk of the trade fragmentation and trade wars becomes higher. And the third question on, sorry, what was the third part again?
Even if we achieve it, can we keep it?
Yeah,
keep our high income?
How would you maintain it? So a couple of points here. So one is attaining high income is not a one-way street. So if you think of the country I was in before Malaysia, I was 5 years in Russia. If you think of Argentina, if you think of Venezuela, these 3 countries used to be high income. They've all slipped back to upper middle income, to middle income countries. If you think of what's common among these 3 countries, so Russia and Venezuela, oil exporters like Malaysia, commodity exporters. Argentina and Venezuela, they messed up their macro. So the point is that attaining high income is not one way. You cannot drop your eye, you cannot drop the ball on the macro, on the fiscal, especially for a commodity exporter. So that's point number 1, lesson number 1 for Malaysia. The second is, it's not the destination as much as the journey. Do we really care so much about whether Malaysia reached high income today or next year or 2029 when you still have 1 in 5 children in Malaysia who are malnutrition, who suffer from stunting? Learning poverty is 40% compared to 2-3% in Korea and Singapore. So I think we need to reduce our obsession of trying to get to high income. Is the journey, not the destination, that counts. And this goes, I would love to hear, it's not like Indermit and I have chatted about it, and I'd love to hear Indermit's take on this. So I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And then third and final point I would make is that as of now, Malaysia has 13 states and 3 federal territories, and only 4 of these entities are above our high income threshold. Only 4 of the 16-odd states and FTs, right? 16 states and FTs. So even if Malaysia were to become high income, you run the risk of the Malaysians in the other 9-10 states or federal territories saying, how come my country is rich, but I'm poor? How come I live in a poor state? Right? So how do you balance in some ways? How do you bring everyone along? That is a tough question. And this is where I think loosening the reins a bit, giving states and subnationals more fiscal autonomy to run their affairs would surely help. And if I could just end with this, I, of course, love Indermit's 3I framework, but I want to propose a tweak to it. And if you want to avoid the risk of reversal, if you want to avoid this vexing question of why do I live in a poor state if my country is rich, I would suggest that we all think of something called upgrade to VIP status. Okay, so V is for vulnerable, so protect your vulnerable. That's really important as you move to high income. I, you can choose any of the 3 I's Indermit has proposed. Investment, I think Malaysia still needs investment. and infusion and innovation. And the P is really for productivity. You have to embrace productivity. So if you can upgrade ourselves from the 3I to a VIP status, I think that reduces the risk of reversal and slippage.
Okay, something to easy remember, VIP. At this stage, I think we're going to have our first round of questions because we want to be interactive as possible. So mics are available. Please just raise your hand, tell us your name, where you're from. Would also help if you keep the questions short, and also tell us who is it directed at, because we have 5 panelists up here. Who would like to take the first question? The mics. Shall we start with the gentleman at the back, the one with the white shirt?
Hello, I'm Yongzhen. I'm a graduate student in economics from Monash, Australia. My question is directed at Dr.Indermit Gill. So, as we know, a large chunk of the global population is in middle-income countries. So, how relevant are policies that are targeting the, let's say, missing Einstein's problem in the growth literature, like locating the talent, providing them with enough human capital and possible fiscal capital so that they go on to innovate and found superstar firms, and then you have the technology spillovers on that side. So how relevant are these sorts of policies for escaping the middle income trap? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, sorry, you wanted the question for who? We didn't catch you. Indermit, okay.
I don't know the answer.
Chintong, that has your name on it. Huh? Okay, we'll take a few more questions. Anyone? There's someone in the second row.
Good evening, and thank you to all the distinguished panelists for this enlightening session today, and also a special thank you to Dr. Gill, who is incidentally an alum of my university, the University of Chicago. We had a fun chat about that earlier. And my question, and also to Dr. Apurva right there, my question is related to the question, so like something that is similar to what Dr. Apurva had pointed out earlier, that essentially we had not talked about the little red dot down south. But I'd like to point out another small elephant, and that is the nature of the infusion that is coming up in the coming days. As we think about, and I think Dr. Gill, this is particularly suited to you, as we think about the development of artificial intelligence technologies and how these interface with Malaysia in developing semiconductors, and also the reality that artificial intelligence is non-decreasing in capability. I have read books that cite that essentially, well, the performance will not decrease, the ability of these machines will not decrease. And how do you anticipate that this new technology will end up influencing, well, the transition from middle-income countries into high-income status, if it will influence it? And do you feel that this change is in any way materially different from any form of technological change that had come in any era past? Thank you.
The role of AI.
I have a very hard time understanding the questions because of the echo.
Yeah, I think he was basically saying whether, you know, AI will disrupt any of the theories that you currently have in the World Development Report.
You know, I think, so I actually looked at this whole AI thing, so you can think about AI as the 4th general purpose technology, the 4th wave. The first 3 waves were steam, then after there was electricity, and then there was information technology, and now there's artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on. If you look at these things, you actually find that they have when these new technologies were introduced, they evoked very similar fears that this would lead to mass unemployment, it would lead to massive changes or drops in privacy, etc., etc. It turns out that it didn't lead to mass unemployment. It actually led to a lot of structural change in the sense that the first few changes actually led to far greater efficiency in agriculture, for example. So as a result, it freed up a lot of labor, then into manufacturing and so on. The main difference between AI and the other three technologies is that over time you find that the rate at which these technologies get diffused into the economy, that rate has picked up a lot. So it took about 80 years for electricity, for steam to become mainstream into the economy. It took about 40 years for electricity to do that. It took about 20 years for information technology to do it. It'll take less time. It'll take maybe half that time for AI to do it. So the pace is very rapid. That's the first thing. The second thing is you seldom find that countries can skip general purpose technologies. You have to go, if you didn't have steam power, you didn't take advantage of electricity. If you didn't have electricity, you couldn't do IT. If you didn't do IT, you couldn't think. I think Malaysia in many ways is actually well situated for AI because it has done the first three things. Think of so many countries around the world that actually have not yet mainstream information technology. Many countries that actually don't even have electricity, you know. So in some sense, the way I sort of see it is the conditions for these things for Malaysia are actually very, very high, are very good. Now, if you look around, you actually find that, you know, there are big countries like India or China and others that may not be that where it's harder to get the whole population ready. So one of the things that we found in the World Development Report is that India has done a very good job of getting ready for these new technologies. The problem is that it goes back to this thing about actually that you have to shift to, that countries like India may have to shift to innovation much more quickly than otherwise. Because what happens is that to the extent that intellectual property about AI technologies and so on is owned elsewhere, what will happen is that countries like India, even if they try to sort of use this for services and so on, they will have to pay.
Yeah.
So you will actually have, you will have an outflow of money at a very early level. So some of these things, I'm not giving you a good answer because I think but 2 years from now, we have, not the next World Development Report, but the one after that will answer exactly this question for you.
Okay.
And I think by that time, we'll be a little clearer about it.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
I
Dr.
think
Sri.
to me, AI is going to be very important in determining competitiveness of governments and competitiveness of companies and competitiveness of individuals. So those countries, those companies, individuals who embrace artificial intelligence, they'll become so kiasu. By the way, the word kiasu is already in the Oxford English Dictionary. It means head to lose. So those ones who embrace AI, really embrace it, they'll become so competitive they win the race. That could be in a certain individual, that could be companies, that could be governments. So if you look today, we spend a lot of money, which is good, on data centers. Quietly, Singapore is focusing their attention on AI, less on data centers per se. So you have to think very hard about where do you put the money in. So I just worry that we spend too long a time on the data centers, like the story I said about the electronics industry in Penang. We stayed for very long in assembly, and the core component part, we forgot about the design and the intellectual property. So in the same way, the real money in the applications of AI.
Yeah, the multiplier
Not
effect.
so much the data centers here. Yeah. Data centers can be quite dirty as well, because when you look at energy transition, consumes a lot of energy. So I think that's good because it brings in investment to the country, but we have to think further ahead down the road.
So Chin Tong, I think you have a point on that, right? Because data centers are booming in your state, Johor, but questions about sustainability, the use of water, the use of electricity, what really is the multiplier effect here?
Yeah, I just briefly touch on the data center, and my view is that we need to have more stringent scrutiny on what they call energy efficiency and also water efficiency of the data centers. And Tunku Zafro has made it quite clear, we want AI data center, but not all data centers. But I want to come back to 2+1 questions on the question of industrial policy and geopolitics and a bit on talent. See, we are now in a situation where maybe export-led industrialization strategy may come to interface with geopolitical crisis. For the longest of time, at least for the last 50 to 60 years, export-led industrialization was Asia's way to get rich. From Japan, followed by South Korea, followed by Taiwan, the dragons, the tigers. Everyone was assuming that, and later on China, everyone was assuming that the United States, and to a lesser extent, Europe, as the importer of the last resort. So the destination is towards the United States and to a lesser extent, Europe. But we have come to a stage where the United States has a shrinking middle class. So the United States middle class has shrunk, yet China and Asia has become so efficient in its production. So efficient in its production that the United States middle class may not be able to consume. So we are coming to a situation where we do not build new market. If we do not make Southeast Asia a middle class society, if we do not make Africa and Latin America a lot more richer, we will come into a situation where there's no more market because the importer of the last resort doesn't want to import because its middle class is shrinking and it cannot consume as much as it is produced in China, in Asia, and particularly in China. So I think that is the crux of the trade war that we are facing. A bit on trade war, a bit on talent. I always say that there's no talent problem in Malaysia. There's no talent problem in Malaysia. Just that they are all living in Singapore. We have 1.3 million Malaysians working in Singapore. 1.1 to 1.3, some of them are naturalized as Singapore citizens. It is very much not because of anything, but because of the wage structure here. And the wage structure is linked to the economic activities that we are doing, the low-end production method or production system that we are working, we have been in the last 20 years, and the inability to get out of it. So we will have to look at the wage structure. We will have to look at how much investment goes in, how much technology goes in, and what sort of policy to change that. And a bit on talent as well. 65% of public universities students are women. 65%. All university in this country, about 57% are women. Civil service is 58% women. And 42% women are holding leadership position in civil service above Jusasi. However, Malaysia has the lowest female labor participation rate in the region.
Yeah. We are only, what, 56%?
Sorry?
Compared to men at 82%.
Yeah, we are 56% now. So that contradiction is where wage comes into play, and wage is related to our industrial structure, our economic structure.
Apurva, I know you want to say something.
Okay, so the audio is very freaky here, I have to say, for us on stage. So I wanted to make 3 quick points on the question on AI. The first is economists will argue and debate about whether AI is good for the economy, whether it creates more jobs and it destroys, etc. I don't think we know, and time will tell. But for me, the main concern about AI is generative AI, the use of deepfakes, what it does or may do to undermine the democratic and social fabric of society. So if that goes south, then whatever AI does on the economy really doesn't matter. Now, the silver lining there is that the AI industry itself is aware of it and is putting in measure certain techniques to watermark and so on and so forth. But that is an important thing to keep our eye on. The second thing on AI is, if you think of tech, tech is neither good nor bad. Now, previously, tech was actually good for women. So if you think of vacuum cleaners, washing machines, microwaves, they freed our moms and grandmoms from doing regular household chores, right? And they made them more productive members of society in the sense they were able to join the labor force. But with AI and today's tech, that can go in the opposite way. And let me just spend a few seconds on this. So if you look at the demand for AI is booming, right? But globally, only 1 in 3 jobs are attractive to women in AI. In Malaysia itself, I read some statistic that only 35% of women in Malaysia are in the tech workforce, right? And then if you think of even something as basic as Siri or one of these, any of these apps, the default setting is actually for female voice. And it perpetuates gender stereotypes of females as subservient and easy to please virtual attendants. And why is that? Because most engineers that provide input into these AI bots and so on and so forth are male engineers. So that's something to really keep an eye on. And finally, but I think the gender bias cuts both ways. The gender, there's also a gender bias against house husbands, so to speak. Anyway, I'm digressing now, but 3 points in AI is really the democratic social fabric and what AI will do to it, and perpetuating gender stereotypes, but gender stereotypes cut both ways.
Okay.
Just to add on, because I remember in terms of the abuse of AI, I think a lot of us had to report to MCMC because somehow I'm online promoting some medication that I did not sign up for, and it's extremely convincing. But I think for Malaysia, yes, we should be rightly concerned. You don't want to be just focusing on data centers alone. And that's why the setup of AI departments, even in UUM, Kedah, and some of the university course and curriculums, the offerings is very crucial, because you do want to make sure you have sufficient human capital to understand the challenges of AI utilization, regulation, and how to manage it if it does end up displacing some jobs in certain sectors. That's one. And number two, I just want to go back to the whole issue of industrialization, because I think before this, there's a lot of focus on this endogenous growth models, right? Everything's about, okay, what can the country do to improve human capital? What can the country do to kind of improve efficiency? But I think when Keon Lee, I'm sorry to refer to him, but I felt heard. As a middle-income country, I felt heard. Because at the end of the day, there are these externalities. You talk about whether it's the intellectual property regime, which is not just affecting countries like Malaysia. You're talking about countries in South Korea, facing in the development of the Hep B medication. Malaysia, we actually had to circumvent it in the development of Hep C treatment to draw down prices from 80,000 US dollars to 300 US dollars. But of course, again, it's not really kind of entrusting ourselves, our souls, our future to the IPR regime. So for me, we really need to place ourselves, even as we want to kind of revive SMEs. Do we allow them to still be stuck with these ESG targets that they have to fulfill? Does it really help them in order to produce the next big business from the local firms that are in our midst? So for me, understanding IPR also includes that, I would say, if you handhold them to produce more utility models, patents, and trademarks, that's okay as a handhold or handheld gesture, not throwing money into perhaps my pet project or something I feel sounds great, or these are the things that require that kind of seamless integration with the experts and whether the scientists, whether the economists, but it must be seen as a joint effort. And I worry maybe at times we are working too much on our own in different silos.
Yeah. Chin Tong, I have got a question for you, and this is related to Indermit's slides, where we see this need to balance creation, preservation, and destruction with an emphasis on rewarding merit. Now, how do we balance this in Malaysia, which is something Apuva highlighted, preservation, because SMEs are the bulk of firms in this country, and let's face it, some are unproductive. Is the government prepared to let some go? Or how can we actually raise the bar for them in a meaningful way?
Okay. Over the years, the government, over successive government, there has been a lot of rhetorics about helping the SME. But genuinely, you ask the bottom, probably there are not that much help for them. What is important to me, number one, is to create growth. Once there's growth, there are opportunities. Number two, to ensure that growth actually benefit Malaysian players. That means you have FDI, but you must try to ensure that it benefits Malaysian player. And at the same time, let's say, for example, industrial policy. Industrial policy cannot be just about giving money, cannot be just about grant. We have multiple grants trying to help the SME. But the point is, industrial policy must encourage innovation, encourage also entrepreneurial spirit. So the entrepreneurial spirit shouldn't be taken away. Shouldn't be taken away by industrial policy. Industrial policy should be supporting and encouraging entrepreneurial spirit in innovation. And once you take all this together, the role of the government is to really create growth and an active local scene that the government comes in to push for entrepreneurial spirit in innovation, and eventually it will grow. Can the government actually ensure which firms to close down or not to close down? Successive government has tried to say that they're trying to do, and I don't think there has been much result.
Yeah. Dato Sri, I have a question for you, and you know something that Indermit brought out about the diaspora and the importance it can play. And you're right, like Chin Tong says, 1 million over Malaysians working in Singapore. So what can we really do to, from your perspective, what can we do to attract them to come back? It seems like wages is but just one of the considerations.
I do agree with Chin Tong. The wages is one key one. But I do believe that Malaysia, we had this new economic policy that we've kept for a very long time. By the way, my son and I have a weekly podcast called The Game, The Impossible. There was one guy that asked the question, continuously asking me the question, what should we do with NEP? And my response, we should get rid of it. But we wouldn't get rid of NEP, the new economic policy, but we should not leave a vacuum. We should replace it with a new policy that's inclusive of all. If you came with a new policy and say, we'll help all the poor in this country, affirmative action, regardless of race and religion, whether it's Iban, whether it's Malay, whether it's Bidayu, whether it's Chinese, whether it's Indian, as long as they belong in the bottom 40%, we will apply equal affirmative action. I think that's the way to go. So I think we should come and change that. And so the interesting thing was, I think we had 33,000 views on TikTok. And when I watched it, a lot of them were rather positive about the idea, simply because, but if we want to make changes of this nature, it requires real leadership, transformational leadership. And Professor Matti Linsky in Harvard once said, transformational leadership is about disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. So we have to make some radical changes. As already mentioned earlier on, we have to do some structural changes. We can't keep playing the same tune, the same game all the time. I can tell you, honest to myself, I agree with him. To get out from middle income trap, now it's going to be a lot harder than it used to be. Totally, and it's not easy now. I can tell you when I was a minister in 2010, you may remember we had the ETP, we said we will reach high-income nation by the year 2020. You guys remember this. And we charted out the way how to get there. I can assure you, if the exchange rate remained the same as it was in 2010, we would have reached high-income status by 2015. We were outstripping it by 3% in 2015. In 2016, we would have been 5% ahead of the World Bank threshold. But the problem was, what we didn't control was the effect of the depreciating ringgit vis-a-vis the dollar. In Malaysian currency, we've already made it. So the problem here today is, to the question that you raised to Apurva before, when do we get there? I would put the question is that, what are the assumptions on exchange rates? Because everything has to be translated back into US dollar. I look over a 2-year period. How many governments have slipped their GNI per capita during the 2 intervening period? If my number shows 58, including Australia, including Singapore. Many of them have slipped, mainly because of currency. So I think it's a lot harder to get to that if we want to do it. So I would say today, if we want to stay there and be ensconced in the high-income nation, we have to change the game. There are fundamental reforms that has to take place. There can be reforms that are, as you said, how do you bring those guys, young people, to come back?
Yes.
I think that's the impression they have, is that our country is not inclusive.
Why do I want to come back, right?
So if we were to go out and get rid of the NEP and replace with a new policy that's inclusive of all race and religion, I think a lot of people would be prepared to come back.
I have a quick response to that. Very often, people look at how to get the top talent to come back. The top talent has a lot of considerations. But where I represent, the seats that I represent the state seat and the parliamentary seat at the doorstep of Singapore. Every morning at the causeway, 50,000 Malaysians are on motorbike entering Singapore and coming back in the evening. My goal in life, or my goal in my political life, is to see those people not having to go to work in Singapore. And what do they need? They need 2/3 of Singapore pay. And they are at the bottom. They are cleaning toilets in Singapore. They are security guards. They are factory workers in Singapore. And they are all races. To me, it is about getting the bottom people not having to drive a Grab, not having to drive Food Panda, not having to work in Singapore as cheap labor. While it is okay for people who are CEO, it is okay for an Indian to have a CEO as in Microsoft. It doesn't matter. Those people at the top is not our focus, because they will fend for themselves. But as a nation, it is about getting the bottom people better pay, better jobs, and it's not so difficult. Because 2/3 of Singapore pay, you're talking about those people who are on motorbike, it is really only 4,000-5,000 ringgit. If we can reduce the number of unskilled labor, create a tighter labor market, there will be many more factory jobs that pay 4,000 or 5,000 ringgit. And that will change the whole ecosystem.
Yes, Indermit.
I agree with the minister. I think basically, if you have Singapore has a per capita income that is 3 times that of Malaysia, you will not be able to prevent people going from here to there to work. So in a sense, what you've just done is you've just restated the problem of growth. The only way you stop that is by converging to Singapore's per capita income levels. So that, and once you do converge, then there'll be as many Singaporeans coming here as Malaysians going to Singapore. That's the first thing, right? The second thing is, you also mentioned that there are all these sort of cheap, like essentially low-skilled workers coming to, if you look at the United States, you have low-skilled workers coming to the United States too. But the difference is that there are high-skilled workers coming to the United States as well. So it's not the fact that there aren't people, of course you need people to come and build buildings and build roads and so on, because it may well be that KL is well built and Penang is well built. There are lots of parts of Malaysia that still need that building. So it's not the case that you don't need those low-wage workers. The real issue is, why isn't it that high-wage workers are not coming why are they going to Singapore? Why are they not coming to Malaysia? It is because, generally speaking, what those high-wage workers are going to do is that they're going to be, unlike the low-wage workers who are going to be working in non-tradable things like construction, the high-wage workers are going to be working in tradable things, which means that they're going to be producing for the world markets. They'll only produce for the world markets if you can produce those things more efficiently than any other country in the world. If you're not efficient, then you're not going to get those people. So you can make it as inclusive as you like. You can make it as beautiful as you like. I don't think Malaysia can become too much more beautiful. It's a beautiful place. But you can do all of those things, and you won't attract those guys until you make this place work more efficiently. And I think some of those things does require a revisiting. I agree with Dr. Idris that you do need to sort of see these institutions or these policies that were designed for a different time and that have continued to think. Somebody has to put a bullet in it. It will not die on its own. So you have to put a bullet in it. Yeah.
To produce more efficiently, it is not about the workers. It's about the machine that you put in, the capital that you put in. So the problem is because we are stuck with this low-wage model where we have huge number of unskilled foreign labor in our system, and therefore there was no incentive to even automate. So we have factories that do not automate because they're doing very well. And therefore we import unskilled foreign labor, and then Malaysians go into Singapore to work as unskilled labor. But once you change the equation, there will be a lot more investment into creating productivities here through machine. So I think that is something that we need to rethink.
Okay, Nurul, yes?
A bit more. Yeah, because Chin Tong has been speaking about this low-wage, low-labor model conundrum since we were members of parliament, when we first became members of parliament. And I think it's a very important point because we might have big businesses, right? We might have big GLCs, but Dr. Indermit, how many of them have made the transition from OEM to OBM? Original brand manufacturers, how many of them? And that makes a difference because we actually met a few of them who said, I want to come back to Malaysia, Malaysia is my +1, but it's very challenging because the focus in the ecosystem is still very much favoring, in a way, the traditional concept of inviting FDI, multinationals is part of our legacy. I mean, to be fair, it's part of our, So to kind of make that change, of course, is not going to be easy, but it affects him because when he came back 12 years ago, all his workers eventually left, all these engineers he trained left for that tiny red dot down south, right? And he was very bitter about it because he wants to do this. And he says, but you must also, through government policy, make it also easy for us, make it inviting, make us matter. And I think through KL20, to be fair, they've invited more of innovators, entrepreneurs, but I think we just have to keep at it, right? Because it's hard work. But this transition, just because you have big businesses, you can't rest on your laurels. You have to compete, not anymore with this small, very calm pond, just really nice. But the world is a very bad and dangerous place. Extremely unfair, non-level playing field. So I think that's why, whether it's through BRICS, it's through the new development bank, these are good because it shakes up whatever consensus or whatever status quo, but it also needs to shake us up, shake our GLCs up, because it's not like it's 20 years ago. It's a new frontier, a new sets of challenges, and we have so much lesser fiscal space. And a community kids who are completely beaten by the pandemic. So I think that sense of urgency, it'll help to feel scared for the future.
I see your point of view, but the one thing I always question is whether we have the political will. Because we have enough brains. We have a lot of policies in place. We love our working papers in Malaysia. We've got, in a short space of time, we've had the Madani government framework, we've had NETA, NIMP, now we have National Semiconductor Strategy. But Apurva, I'm going to ask you this because you're based here. What is that missing piece between plans and implementation? What are we not doing that we should do immediately?
Okay, I was going to comment on the brain drain, but maybe I'll do that later since you asked me this more recent question. So this is one of my favorite parts because I get to ask you guys, the audience, this riddle. Okay, so imagine that there are 3 birds sitting on a tree branch, 3 birds on a tree branch, and 2 of them decide to fly away. How many are left? Most of you would say 1. It's a trick question, but the instinct is to say 1. And the question was 3 birds on a branch, 2 of them decide to go away, fly away. How many are left? The answer is still 3, because there's a difference between deciding and doing. And this is the problem with Malaysia. Malaysia has one too many plans, and to some extent, these plans serve a purpose. This is not to diss the plans; they present a vision and so on and so forth. But where the policy rubber hits the rakyat road is on the implementation. And there are many reasons why implementation doesn't happen as effectively, as efficiently, fragmentation of agencies and duplication and so on and so forth. I won't dwell on that because I have one very important, it's a totally boring topic, but it's as important as peanuts are to nasi lemak, which is where I think the big gap is between policy and implementation. And that is an almost absent culture of monitoring and evaluation of projects. So let me just elaborate a bit on that. If you think of not to pick on any one project in particular, but there was this project called the Madani Medical Scheme last year. It was piloted in February. It was downscaled in September and upscaled in September and downscaled earlier this year. Okay, so this piloting, downscaling, upscaling, whatever it was, and the scheme was to provide healthcare to poor people, operative healthcare to poorer people. But if you're the rakyat, Indermit rakyat is a common one. If you're the rakyat, how do you know if this was worth downscaling and upscaling without any monitoring and evaluation and communication? So if we have plans and if we implement and if we don't know where they are headed, I mean, it's perfectly okay to experiment because development is a game of snakes and ladders. But you need to have these policies in place for monitoring and evaluation. Otherwise, you don't know what you don't know. You don't know if a project is failed because you didn't know enough, or you're seeing what you want to see. So this is really, really a missing link in all the big plans and policies and lack of implementation. And if I could just say one more point, as an economist, one of the gold standards in monitoring and evaluation is something what economists call RCTs, random control trials. These are experiments that economists basically shoplifted from the medical field. And economists have won Nobel Prizes for this. But that's beside the point. So gold standard in the economic and policy evaluation field these days is RCTs. The acronym is not important. What I'm about to say is more important. Now, if you look at something called the AEA registry for RCTs, Indonesia has over 90 registered RCTs. Vietnam has over 40 registered RCTs. So RCTs are a proxy of how good the culture is of monitoring and evaluation. Malaysia, any guesses? Indonesia 90, Vietnam over 40, Malaysia big fat 0. Okay? So here, I must give credit to my colleagues in the bank, Akash and others, who are really spearheading the need to instill a culture of monitoring and evaluation. Because if you don't learn from failure, you're bound to fail.
Okay, we are really running out of time, but I think there's a gentleman in front that has one question. Yes, sir. The one with the red tie. We'll just take one question only from the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Iqbal. I'm from the Malaysian Institute of Management. To save you, I'm not going to ask a question. I just want to make a small comment. The comment goes to the economic growth in middle-income countries. I want to give a compliment to Dr. I almost misread your name, Interjit, the mythological figure in India, which gives you a lot of visionary statements and other things, and you have done that, sir, excellently. Your graphical presentation is very well done, very well received. The question is, how can countries escape from this middle-income trap? We also heard that Malaysia is in the middle-income trap, but if statistics are to be taken into consideration, especially the exchange rate syndrome, we would have been there much earlier. But one of the panelists, Dr. Sri Idris Jala, did mention about our Vision 2020. If far back we have come a long way and we still have not escaped ourselves from this middle-income trap, what are the reasons? I think some of the aberrations came out very well.
Yes.
But the question now is, I don't want the panel to answer, that will be another panel session for another 2 hours. But what should be prioritized in order for us to escape from this middle-income trap without our feet getting too stuck where we will never come out of it? That is my little comment. Once again, for the panelists and Dr. Indermit, well done. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have one last question to wrap up the session, and it's more reflection, Indermit. You've heard from the audience, you've heard from the panelists. Any closing remarks for us?
Well, for me, I just wanted to say one thing, that I have heard from Tuan Nurul that, you know, that she reads the work of Hajun Chang and people like that, and what's their name, Joseph Stiglitz, who used to be at the World Bank and everything. You know, if you look at what these guys have been talking about, they've been talking about the same things for the last 20, 30 years. How much has it helped? How much have the ideas helped? They haven't changed what they're saying. Now, it's not like we were correct then and we are not correct now. We have changed what we say because we are looking at the problems, and some of the things that we said that we thought would work didn't work. So we've changed what we say. But these characters are saying the same thing today than they did 20 years back. That's one. So you should immediately question them a little bit more and spend more time with us. That's one thing. Number two, you know, we did, so I used to teach until 2 or 3 years ago, and I had our students do a fairly comprehensive assessment of which countries followed the Washington Consensus and which ones didn't, okay? There was one country that actually came very close to following all 10 tenets of the Washington Consensus. South Korea. South Korea. Now, they did other things besides those 10 things, and other people also did different things. The country that did the least of those things, Argentina. Look where South Korea is, look where Argentina is. They swapped places in terms of per capita incomes, okay? So, so anyway, but that's not enough. You know, those Washington, that stuff is not enough. There has to be something more. I think to actually, my concluding thing would be Malaysia is almost there. Almost there in terms of not just to get to $15,000. Malaysia will get to $15,000. But it would be the grossest underachievement if Malaysia's objective is just to get to $15,000. Why not $45,000? Why not $50,000? You know? So you need to get to that point in a shape that you can continue to grow on to, you know, it may not be at 5% a year, it may be 3 or 4% a year, but you have to keep going that way, right? Those guys are not going to give you the answer. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Hi. So, Dr. Indermit, thank you. Thank you for your comments, because I had a lot of the Washington consensus when I was studying Washington at SAIS. So I concur, right? Of course, we understand, and that was the model that Malaysia also adopted in terms of, you know, cheap labor, export-oriented for many years, open to trading, and even FDI. So what I would add that's a bit different, that we should really quantify, was Keon Lee's econometrics analysis, comparing the different countries, comparing in detail. And it's not just about theories, because of course, you know, you have varying and differences of opinion, and I'm not asking us to completely depart from status quo, but what I am asking is to look at, for example, in the example of South Korea, how much was lost in terms of time, in terms of even the withstanding or defending themselves against the challenge through IPR, the different companies against taxes instruments and so on and so forth. And how Malaysia, for example, we have not, I think, yeah, which was identified by Keon Lee, not Joseph Stiglitz, yeah, did not really identify how the SMEs can improve the production of trademarks, utility models to spur domestic economy before moving on to patents. And I looked at the numbers under MOSTI website. I was extremely worried. From the year 2002 to 2017, you've seen a drop either in patent production, in terms of publications. So I think it's a good time to kind of leverage deeper. As someone, you know, we still believe in trading, certainly, but I think when we talk about kicking away the ladder, it's just to understand when it's an uneven playing field. And it happens in Malaysia as well. You know, some challenges that was brought up by the startups against the bigger boys or bigger girls, right? So I think we must be mindful and open, Dr. Indermit. And I think that's where I'm coming from, not ideologically stuck, where sometimes, you know, state interventions, engagements, and of course Malaysia always having the right dynamic between the different superpowers at play. I think this is where we're at, but you know, I take your point, and again, thank you for reminding me of Washington so very well.
Okay, we have, I think Apurva wants to have the final word. You? We have 1 minute, Apurva.
I'll take less. No, Nurul, I'm totally on your side. I'm sitting right next to you, not next to Indermit. So I just saw my colleague Ririn, who's from Indonesia, and just remind me, I'm ending on a light note here, yeah? So Indermit said that Malaysia is not middle income yet, you know, and so Indonesians are very optimistic people. High income yet. I mentioned high income yet, yeah? The Indonesians are very optimistic people, and this reminded me of a comment by Mark Baird, who our former colleague, used to be country director of Indonesia, and he told me that if you ask an 90-year-old Indonesian lady, spinster, are you married? And her answer is, no, not yet. So hope springs eternal.
It does. It's the journey for us. On that note, thank you to all our panelists. Back to you, Shakira.
Can we give a round of applause to our panelists? Thank you very much to our distinguished panelists for this lively session. And thank you to the audience. I would like to request for the panelists and speakers to remain on stage, and I would like to invite Dr. Indermit and Dr. Yasuhiko Matsuda, Country Manager for the World Bank Group, Inclusive Growth and Sustainable Finance Hub, onto the stage for a group photo. We have come to the end of the keynote lecture today. We hope you have enjoyed the afternoon. Terima kasih, salam sejahtera, and thank you very much.